The Nintendo 64 has to be the most divisive console I've ever seen. It had quite a few good games on it, but it was also not designed that well, causing the system to have numerous issues throughout its life, which also resulted in it not having that many games worth coming back to. So, let's use hindsight to fix it. I'll be going over the hardware, software, and Nintendo. The biggest issue the console had, from what the user could see, is the lack of a CD drive. This, and a second big reason we'll talk about later, was why big names like Square left Nintendo for Sony. While cartridges did lower loading times, the drawbacks they had were far too big for the single benefit of faster loading. Because of that, let's add a 2x CD drive to speed up the system. The second biggest issue the console had was very high memory latency. You see, the Nintendo 64 had unified RAM, and that unified RAM was very high latency. The mixture of these two resulted in the CPU and GPU basically idling for half the time, remaining unused. To fix this, we'll make a significant hardware change. We'll replace the RDRAM with standard DRAM, 4 MB of the stuff, and both the CPU and GPU can access it. But we'll also give the GPU an exclusive 1 MB of SGRAM. This would let the GPU do the most intensive operations like depth testing and frame buffer drawing without needing to access the main RAM, and it would drastically improve the usability of the system and speed up development. The third biggest issue is more a small collection of issues. First, let the GPU load textures in on more than one cycle. Second, give the developer more control over what type of filtering and blurring their textures and polygons have. This would let developers choose if they want smooth textures or sharp textures for each texture. Thirdly, change how the video output compositor works. Basically, the compositor on the Nintendo 64 pushes out frames exactly as the video standard wants. In America, if a game is running at 30 FPS, it will output frames at 30 FPS. If a game is running at 45 FPS, here's where shit hits the fan. Basically, you will get one 30 FPS frame, followed by one 60 FPS frame, then a second 30 FPS frame, and so on. In short, this ends up making games look very laggy and stuttery if they drop frames from their intended locked frame rates. This is only visible on real hardware, and most emulators don't have issues with it, so many people aren't aware of it. So obviously they should change this to a much less sensitive compositor similar to the one featured in the Saturn or the PlayStation 1. Now let's talk about the controller. We all know the Nintendo 64 controller memes, and I have a way of changing the controller without changing much of it. First of all, obviously, fix the stick, give it a metal base, lube it and give it a rubbery tip. Then you should turn it into a hoary mini pad, but the stick is in the center and the controller is a little wider. This fixes so many issues. Basically, you could use it as intended. You could switch between the 3 control styles, but you wouldn't need 3 hands. It'd be so much more usable. Now, let's deal with Nintendo. Nintendo did not adapt, even when Sony was destroying them in market share. Basically, Nintendo had very, very high licensing costs on their platform. And this is the second big reason why Square and others chose Sony. While PS1 developers could earn upwards of $30 per game sold, on the Nintendo 64, they only earned it up to 10 at most. And the cartridge manufacturing costs were so high that the startup prices for development were also far higher, and all of those drove off developers. And as the Saturn was hard to develop for, who else would they choose but Sony? As we're now using discs and not cartridges, let's say a time traveler told Nintendo they should have better licensing deals, and that way Sony has a bit more competition in the development space. But there's also a software side of things we haven't really talked about, and it's perception. Basically, Nintendo was seen as the kiddie platform up until the Switch. Yeah, the PlayStation had loads of kiddie games, but it's all about how people perceive your product. And Nintendo's biggest marketing flaw was not tapping into the large market of teens and young adults, and instead targeting children and families. Which, this would be a war crime in a combat scenario, but in this case, it's acceptable. Sony meanwhile realized that it's kind of best to advertise to 17-year-olds. Their reasoning for this was that anyone below 17 wanted to appear cool, and therefore liked what 17-year-olds liked, while almost everyone over 17 would probably enjoy the same games they would at 17, and this tactic worked really well. So Nintendo would need to shift their marketing to being an all-ages platform, similarly to what they did with the Switch, versus just being a kiddie platform, which is how they were seen for a while. So, in short, add a CD drive, replace the RDRAM with DRAM, and add 1MB of SGRAM to the GPU. Let the GPU load textures in multiple cycles, let the developers choose filtering and blurring settings. Make the compositor not care about how often it sends frames to the TV. Make the stick not suck, and turn the controller into something similar to the Hori minipad. Make Nintendo actually give good licensing deals to the developers thanks to the CDs. Make Nintendo's advertising appeal more to all ages versus just families with children. The new memory layout would let the console actually utilize its full power. The GPU changes would just make the games look better. The CD drive would let developers make far more types of games for the system and cost far less money to develop for. The controller changes would make it far easier to use, and the licensing and advertising changes would make the console appear far more appealing for developers and consumers. By doing this, I would assume the console would sell a lot better. Though, how much better? There's no point in guesstimating. So, why did I even make this video? Well, the Nintendo 64 is weirdly enough, the console I would want to go back to the second least. Consoles to me are only really worth as much as the games on them, because that's how they are to most people. While the Wii U only has like 5 games worth coming back to, the Nintendo 64 has more, but only just. While it sold around the same as the GameCube and Wii U combined, the GameCube had a far more varied and interesting library. The Wii is a console I'm extremely split on as well, as while it did have a library full of stuff like Calvin Tucker's Redneck Jamboree, it also had really interesting games like Wario Land Shake It, Battalion Wars 2, Arcrise Fantasia, Earthseeker, and more. Even so, the Nintendo 64 has to be the system that's the most frustrating to look back at, mainly because of the nostalgia surrounding it. It's really difficult to try to explain to someone why their favorite system isn't the best thing ever, because very often they'll try to argue stuff like how it was the first real 3D system, because it had some random tech spec, like a hardware Z buffer, unlike the PS1 or Saturn. And maybe instead of just arguing about why your system is the superior one and how much better and cooler it is, maybe you should try something new. Maybe you should try a new game from that other system. Maybe you'll like it. What I'm saying is you should try to play Mega Man Legends 2.